Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are continuing our reading of Real Grit by Silas Hocking. We are very close to the end of this series now. In fact, merely 4 chapters from the end. We will be beginning today at chapter 32. And chapter 35 is the last in the book. But just as with Treasure Island, the end of the book will not be the end of us. I have some ideas about what we will read next, and I hope that you will enjoy them when they come to fruition. Until then, though, let us focus on the adventures of Jack Formby, newly risen from his sickbed and returned to health. He made his way to Cornwall to look into a potential job that he could do there, and to see the love of his life, Ada Woodville, who, through reading of a noble man by the name of Jack Robinson in the local newspaper, believes still in her heart that Jack is alive. He was about to confirm this for her when he met his cousin, who we know to be a bounder of the first degree. While walking along a cliffside, Ralph, sensing that the game would be up if Jack were to make it to his destination, took matters into his own hands and pushed Jack off the cliff. What happens next? We will have to find out as we begin our reading with chapter 32 of Real Grit. An accusing conscience. Ralph did not venture out of doors again during the rest of the afternoon and evening. He was much too excited to put in an appearance at Trevenna House, and there was no place else he cared to go to. Mrs. Juleth, the farmer's wife, was very much surprised to see him back again so soon, but he excused himself on the plea of a bad headache, and said if he were no better, he should not venture out of doors again. Mrs. Juleth recommended several infallible remedies, 1 or 2 of which Ralph readily consented to take, thus leaving no doubt upon the good woman's mind that her lodger was really ill. Indeed, he looked so flushed and excited, and had such a feverish look about the eyes, to quote Mrs. Juleth, that she was very anxious to send for the doctor. To this, however, Ralph would not submit. Such headaches, he said, had been common occurrences with him of late, and he had no doubt that a good night's rest would set him right. After what had happened, however, a good night's rest was out of the question. He had done many mean, contemptible, and dishonest things in his life, and had rather prided himself on the possession of a conscience that had grown more and more elastic over the years. But to descend to willful murder was more than even his conscience could pass over without reproach, and the eager pleading look in Jack's eyes as he saw him slip over the cliff haunted him like a reproachful ghost, and completely banished all sleep from his eyes. It is true, there was some compensation in the fact that he felt absolutely safe. For years past he had been more or less haunted by the fear that Jack might some day turn up quite unexpectedly and disarrange all his plans. And he experienced now a grim satisfaction in the thought that his kinsman was completely settled at last, and would never trouble him or anyone else again.
"I am in luck's way still,"
he said with a sardonic smile.
"For if the young fool had gone to Bodelford and made himself known to his uncle, or if he had seen Ada before I met him, the case would have been complicated, to say the least. But unless he lied awfully, and I don't think he did, for with all his weaknesses he was always truthful and transparent, he had made himself known to no one, and so he will never be missed, and I'm safe, come what may."
Yet, notwithstanding these comforting reflections, he felt very miserable and ill at ease. He had done a deed which, even in thought, he had always recoiled from. There was blood upon his hands, which all the waters of the great ocean that he heard moaning and sobbing through all the night could not wash away. Several times through the night he felt tempted to steal out of the house and go again to that fatal spot on the cliff and listen for any sounds of life. He knew it was an absurd idea, but the night seemed so horribly long and still. Even the moaning of the sea seemed to make the silence more awful and oppressive. Once or twice he went to the window and threw it open. It was a clear, still, starlit night. All around lay the quiet fields, and beyond the dark line of cliffs stretched away into infinite distance the dark and solemn sea. And every now and then a low moan came up from its heaving bosom, as though it had some dread secret it longed to declare.
"I wish the wind would get up,"
he said to himself,
"and put an end to this horrible stillness. I feel as though I were locked up in a tomb."
But the wind slumbered on, and the silence mocked his fears and filled him with a nameless alarm. As soon as the day began to dawn, he got up and dressed himself, and soon after stole quietly out of the house It was his invariable custom, when staying at Cliff Farm, to have a ramble in the fields each morning before breakfast. Hence, no one would be surprised at his getting up a little earlier than usual, or would question him as to where he had been. He turned his back upon the sea as soon as he got out of the house, and directed his steps toward a plantation of firs about a mile in the distance. He had often sought its shelter when the sun was hot, and enjoyed lying on the moss and bracken, listening to the swish of the wind, making dreamy music among the pine needles high above his head. The morning was oppressively still, for no one was stirring yet. At least, no one was out of doors. Here and there, from the chimneys of cottages perched on the hillsides, blue lines of smoke began to ascend through the still morning air, showing that the farm labourers were preparing for their morning's meal, and would soon be going forth to their toil.
"I am safe from observation yet,"
he said to himself as he left the path he had been pursuing, and turned into another that struck across the fields nearly at right angles. He had not gone many yards, however, ere he changed his course again. He had now his back to the plantation, and his face towards the sea.
"I shall have to go and look," he said to himself. "I'm like Eugene Ram. I cannot keep away from the fatal spot. Perhaps I shall see the body lying stranded upon the rocks."
A quarter of an hour's brisk walking, and he was standing on the edge of the cliffs, scanning with eager eye the dark rocks below. The tide was coming in again, slowly and almost imperceptibly. The narrow, shingly beach was already covered, and the long rollers were breaking on the rocks with mournful music, solemn as a funeral dirge. Once or twice, as he looked and listened, he thought he heard a low moan, as of someone in pain. Could it be, he thought, that his victim was not dead, but was lying, mortally wounded, on the rocks below?
No, that cannot be," he said to himself. "All those rocks were covered at the last tide, and if he'd reached the rocks alive, he would be drowned by the rising water."
But as he scanned the face of the cliff, it hardly seemed possible that anyone, falling from the top, could reach the bottom alive. It was true the precipice at this place was not nearly so perpendicular as in some other parts, yet it was exceedingly steep and serrated with deep fissures crossing it in all directions, and sharp pinnacles and narrow ledges from which a body would bound with terrific force and with fatal consequences.
I may as well make my mind easy, he muttered. He's as dead as a coffin nail, without a doubt. And yet, I can scarcely realize that I actually killed him. It's an awful thought, when one comes to reflect upon it quietly. I'm afraid the memory will darken all my life.
He turned away from the dread place after a while, and directed his steps once more toward the farmhouse, muttering to himself as he did so.
I will come and have another look. A little after noon. The tide will be out then, and the beach will be exposed to view.
Mrs. Jewliff greeted him with anxious inquiries as to the state of his health, and how he had slept during the night, all of which he answered readily enough, and to her evident satisfaction. He informed her that he slept so well during the early part of the night that he awoke fresh as a lark soon after daybreak, and feeling no inclination for further sleep, had been out for a ramble in the fields. "You don't look quite right about the eyes yet," she said.
No, very likely not, he answered. Those distressing headaches always leave traces of pain behind them. But I am much better, and shall be quite right before the day is out.
He had very little appetite for breakfast, and was scarcely able to swallow a morsel. But Pincher, the sheepdog, was quite ready to eat his share, and when Mrs. Jewliff came to clear the table, she congratulated her lodger on making such a good meal. Directly after lunch, he directed his steps once more towards the cliffs. The place seemed to have an irresistible fascination for him, and he made up his mind to return to London on the morrow, that he might be out of reach of its baleful influence. He found the tide at its lowest ebb, and the rocks standing high and dry above the shingle, but nothing that bore any semblance of a human body could be discovered in any direction.
I expect he was washed out with the tide, he said to himself. So much the better. It's a comfort he will never trouble anybody any more.
But in spite of this reflection, he was very miserable. He found that his conscience, though seared, was not dead, and wherever he looked, whether on sea or sky, the word murderer seemed to be written in letters of light and fire.
Had I reflected a moment, he said to himself, I should never have done it. And I would have been happier if I had taken my chance with Ada. I believe she would have been true to me, even if she had known he was alive.
But it was too late now for regrets. The fatal deed was done, and he would have to bear the burden of an accusing conscience as well as he could. Late in the afternoon, he dressed himself with his usual care, and directed his steps towards Trevenna. Ada was on the lookout for him, and was quite prepared for his coming. Chapter 33. A Boating Adventure. We must now return to the previous afternoon. Ada had scarcely finished dinner when, glancing through the window, she espied Madge Tregony bounding across the lawn. Instantly, Ada rose from her chair and went and threw open the French window, and Madge came into the room, bright as a morning's sunshine, and fresh as a summer breeze. "Oh, it's just glorious out of doors, Ada," she said. "The sea is as quiet as a pool, and the air is as sweet as May. It seems a shame to stay indoors on such a glorious evening, and so I have come to drag you out to do a little bit of exercise." "How kind of you," said Ada, laughing. "Do I look as if I should need much dragging?" "No, you look as if you would enjoy a scamper over the downs or a pull in the bay as much as I should. Only I thought somebody might be coming, you know." And Madge looked at her slyly out of the corner of her eye. "If somebody comes, he can wait," said Ada, "but I am not aware that anybody is coming this evening." "So much the better. We shall not have to hurry back. But let us decide before we start whether it is to be a ramble on the downs or a sail on the sea." "Oh, let's go for a sail," said Ada. "It's not often that the sea is so calm as it is tonight, and I enjoy rocking and dreaming on the water in the quiet of the evening." "You sentimental creature," said Madge with a laugh. "But go and get your things on, and let's waste no more time in chatter." "I'd first better tell Sam to go down and get the boat out first." "No, I'll do that," said Madge, "and in the meantime you can be getting ready." A quarter of an hour later, Ada was sitting in the stern of the boat, holding the rudder lines, while Madge was pulling steadily at the oars. No inland lake could have been more placid than was the great ocean that evening. Outside the little landlocked harbour there was just a perceptible swell, like the heaving bosom of a great monster in his sleep. When clear of the headland, Ada hoisted a little sail, and for an hour they slowly drifted before an imperceptible breeze in the direction of St. Tivy. Neither Ada nor Madge seemed in the humour for conversation. Rocking idly on the slowly heaving bosom of the deep, they gave themselves up to reflection. Ada's thoughts were still of Jack. With a woman's intuition, she had jumped to the conclusion that John Robinson was none other than her old lover, and nothing could drive the idea from her mind. She knew as well as anyone that she was building her hopes on a very slender foundation, and that she had absolutely no evidence on which to base her faith. And for that reason, she kept her thoughts to herself, and cherished her hope in secret. But the hope was none the less sweet on that account, though the waiting and longing day after day began to tell upon her spirits, and banish some of the brightness from her conversation. Will he come, or has he forgotten me? Does he love me still, or has he transferred his affections to another? Were some of the questions she was debating with herself, when Madge suddenly called her attention to something white on the rocks, close to the foot of the cliffs. "Is it not a signal of some kind, Ada?" Madge said. "I can't make it out," was the reply. "It looks as if it might be a white pocket handkerchief waved by someone." "It's that, you may depend," said Madge. "Some mussel-gatherer, perhaps, has been caught by the tide. Let's pull in that direction with all speed." Instantly, Madge got her oars to work again, and the boat was soon gliding rapidly towards the cliffs. "Yes, it's a signal of distress," said Ada at length. "I can see a man, very plainly, waving a white pocket handkerchief." At this, Madge redoubled her efforts, and the boat went skimming like an arrow across the waters. A few minutes more, and the boat was among the breakers, while reaches of foamy water wound in and out among the rocky islets, and navigation became an exceedingly difficult matter. Now and then they lost sight of the distress signal, as some huge rock loomed up to the right or left, and once or twice they were almost stranded on the jagged rocks. "This is a risky business," said Madge at length. "If it were not getting so late, it would be policy to go back to Trevenna and send some fishermen to the rescue." "No, that won't do," said Ada. "It would be dark before they could get here." "Oh, we're all right," Madge said after a pause. "Here is fairly open water again." The next moment, Ada was standing up in the boat and calling to the unfortunate man, but she got no answer, while the handkerchief had ceased to wave. "He's fainted, or else he's dead," Madge replied, for they were now almost close to the rock on which he was reclining, his white face upturned to the sky. "Pull close up to the rock," said Ada excitedly. "I can easily reach him." "Why, what's the matter with you?" said Madge, looking up in alarm. "Don't ask me any questions," Ada replied with blanched lips. "Only be quick. There, that will do. Hold her steady a moment." The next moment, she had sprung from the boat and was climbing swiftly over the jagged rocks. In less time than it takes to write it, she had reached the unfortunate man, and was sitting down with his head resting upon her knee, while her hot tears fell like rain upon his brow. "Oh, that I had something to revive him," she murmured passionately. Then, suddenly, she remembered her smelling salts. In less than a moment she had the stopper off, and was holding it under his nose. It had the desired effect. After a violent sneeze, he opened his eyes, and looked up into Ada's face with strange and bewildered expression. But the bewilderment soon gave place to a look of recognition, and with a happy smile he whispered, "Ada, my darling," then closed his eyes again. "Oh, Jack, are you much hurt?" she asked in trembling tones. "Are you able to talk to me?" "I shall be better directly," he whispered. "How good of you to come to my rescue." "I think God must have sent me," she said. "But how did you get here?" "I cannot answer that now," he said. "Some day, perhaps, I will tell you." "Were you coming to see me?" she asked eagerly. "Yes, I was," he replied with a smile, opening his eyes again. "Oh, I knew you would come," she said exultingly. "Ever since I read that in the newspapers, I knew you would come." "Have you been reading about me in the papers?" he asked. "I think so," she answered. "John Robinson and Jack Formby are the same, are they not?" He only smiled for an answer, but it was quite sufficient. "And now, how am I to get you to the boat?" she asked. "I wish I was strong enough to carry you."
"I shall be able to manage directly," he said. "I'm not much hurt, I think, but I am very faint and exhausted."
"Can you walk at all?" she asked anxiously.
"Yes, I think so," he said. "If not, I will crawl. I've been walking along the face of the cliff during the afternoon, so, you see, I'm not to be deterred by trifles."
"What an adventure," she said, looking up at the jagged heights above her.
"Worse even than yours in Boggart Clough," he said with a smile.
And without waiting for her to reply, he raised himself to his feet and made an effort to walk. He found it very much easier, however, to crawl on hands and knees, and in that way, with some considerable assistance from Ada, he managed to reach the boat. Madge had been waiting in a perfect fever of impatience, for twilight was deepening apace, and she remembered how difficult and dangerous it was to steer the boat among the rocks. But she forgot all about the danger when Ada said to her eagerly, as Jack was getting painfully down over the rocks, "Madge, this is Mr. Jack Formby." She was too astonished to reply, and could only stare in blank bewilderment. 100 thoughts and surmises seemed to flash simultaneously through her mind, and a suspicion of the truth shot across her brain like a ray of light, and almost turned her giddy. But she kept her suspicions to herself, and helped Jack into the boat with a firm and steady hand. It was nearly dark by the time they had got clear of the rocks, and then Madge pulled steadily for home. Very few words were spoken during the journey. Each was busy with his or her own thoughts, and so, perhaps, this will be the most fitting place to tell how Jack escaped with his life. To one simple circumstance this was owing. He fell, as the reader will remember, feet foremost, and with his face towards the cliff. As drowning men will grasp a straw, so a falling man will clutch eagerly at whatever may be within his reach. And hence Jack's head had scarcely disappeared over the cliff when his hands eagerly clutched a ragged point of rock, which he held fast with all his might. As we have before stated, the cliff was not perpendicular, and to anyone with a steady head and nerve, a way down to the beach was by no means an impossibility. With great care, Jack worked his way round the rock which he was holding to a hollow under, or more correctly, in the cliff, where, on a broad ledge of rock, he was able to rest while quite invisible from the top. When he had somewhat recovered from the shock, he began to reconnoitre. The easiest thing would be to climb to the surface, but the fear of meeting Ralph a second time drove that idea out of his head. He knew that the beach would be exposed at low water, and so he resolved to work his way along the face of the cliff, steadily downward, and in this way he would be able, he thought, to reach the bottom in safety. It was a perilous undertaking, he knew, but it was his only chance, and so he resolved to risk it. With infinite caution, he worked his way downward, and much more rapidly than he expected. When within a dozen feet of where Ada found him, his foot slipped, and so he concluded his descent much more rapidly than was either safe or pleasant. Indeed, the result of this one false step proved to be a fractured rib and a severely sprained ankle. Sam the gardener was on the lookout for the return of the boat long before it hove into sight, and by his aid Jack reached Trevenna House without attracting any attention. Madge called on Dr. Pendray on her way to the vicarage, and requested him go on to Trevenna House without delay. At Jack's very earnest request, all concerned promised to say nothing of the evening's occurrence till 2 or 3 days had passed away, a promise which, in every case, was honourably kept. And it is at that point that we will end the story for today. But as you know, it is not the end of the story. Next time, on Soft Stories, we will end our reading of Silas Hocking's Real Grit, discover what becomes of our hero, our heroine, and the villain, Ralph Formby. I can't wait, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Goodbye.